Does President Joe Biden have what it takes to stand with Ukraine without provoking a wider war? Will Biden's Disinformation Governance Board protect Americans or quench their freedoms? How could the U.S. Supreme Court allow the unprecedented leak of its draft opinion revoking Roe v. Wade? And how will the court navigate the apparently complex religious freedom cases now before it? We'll talk about all this and more in today's episode of Independent Outlook. Hello, everyone. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, right across the bay from San Francisco. Usually, we launch right into our topics. But before we get into today's discussion, we need to pause for a moment. As many of you may know, this is our first broadcast without David Thoreau, the founder of the Independent Institute, who passed away suddenly and unexpectedly 11 days ago, just a few days after our last broadcast. David Thoreau founded the Independent Institute as an academic, nonprofit, public policy research and educational organization back in 1986. He also founded and led the C.S. Lewis Society of California. You might like to see this wonderful image of David, which we shared on our website. A remarkable man. Here's another image of David a few years ago talking with Peter Thiel. David authored dozens of scholarly and commentary articles, and as publisher, directed the publication of more than 140 scholarly books. He also created and was publisher of our influential quarterly journal, The Independent Review. Would you take a moment of silence with me in recognition of David Thoreau? Thank you very much. Naturally, the Independent Institute is carrying on vigorously in order to honor David's legacy, and that includes carrying on with today's discussion. So let's get started. And I'm glad to tell you that today I'm joined by two of David's longtime colleagues, Ivan Eland and William Watkins. Let me begin with Ivan. So glad to see you, Ivan.
Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure, really. Ivan, of course, is a senior fellow here at the Independent Institute. He's the director of our Center on Peace and Liberty. He holds a PhD from George Washington University, author of multiple books, including most recently with Independent Institute, War and the Rogue Presidency, Restoring the Republic After Congressional Failure. I highly recommend it. You've got another book coming up, Ivan. I think the tentative title is Piercing the Fog of War. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And in the book, you're going to unpack some misperceptions, right?
Yes, well, yes. It's basically, the subtitle is The Scourge of War Begins and Ends at Home. I talk about the domestic causes of some of our wars, which no one ever likes to talk about, the politics behind them, and then also the domestic ill effects of these wars, which, again, probably the most important effect of any war. We've completely lost sight of what the founders realized, that overseas war undermines liberty and society at home. And so Indeed. I go into those for various wars.
So watch your bookshelf coming up soon. Also, of course, you may know Ivan from his publications. He's been in Los Angeles Times, USA Today, in the New York Times even. He's been on TV, PBS, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and so forth. Glad to have Ivan with us very much. Also now, William Watkins Jr. Hello, Bill.
Graham, good to see you. Nice to be with you today.
Thank you. I'm grateful for your joining us today. Bill Watkins is a research fellow here at the Independent Institute, author of, among other things, this wonderful book published by Independent called Crossroads for Liberty, Recovering the Anti-Federalist Values of America's First Constitution. Highly recommended. Bill is published, authored in such legal journals as South Carolina Law Review, Duke Journal of Constitutional Law and Public Policy. You may have seen his writings in Forbes, USA Today, San Francisco Examiner, and so forth. So I love to brag on my colleagues, but really the reason you're here is because you both know a great deal about the world. And I'm going to start with Ivan. Ivan, foreign affairs is your specialty, especially military matters. We're looking across the Atlantic at Ukraine, and I'm just wondering, what's the status of things now? Can you imagine, from what you see, Ivan, some kind of reasonably peaceful way out of this?
Well, unfortunately, at this point, it doesn't. The solution is not obvious, because both sides want to keep fighting. The Ukrainians, because they've had such great success, they've been given weapons and training by the West. They're vastly outnumbered materially and in terms of personnel, but they've done very well so far. So they want to keep going. They want to even kick the Russians out of the disputed Southeast if they can, I think. Well, I don't know if that's possible, but that I think they're getting higher expectations by the day. And the Russians want to fight to get some sort of a victory out of this because they haven't performed very well either on the assault on Kyiv or so far in the area where everyone thought they might do better in the southeast of in the Donbass region.
Why does Russia have its focus on the southeast and the Baltic? I mean, the Black Sea coast.
Well, first of all, the Donbass was already there was already fighting there since 2014. Putin sees Russian-speaking people there as his natural allies, and some of them are, because there's separatists that don't want to be part of Ukraine since 2014. There's other Russian-speaking people in that area, however, who have been violently opposed to the Russian invasion. They thought they were going to take Kharkiv, which is in that just a little north of there, which is the second largest city in Ukraine. They thought they were going to take it in a half a day, and here we are 3 months later, and Kharkiv is still not taken. So invaders often go where they think they're going to have a friendly population because it lowers occupation costs, both in killed and wounded soldiers and, in terms of expenses, expended military hardware and stuff. So this is our last resort, I guess, after not being able to take Kyiv. When they wanted to get the capital, they thought that would fall in 3 days, but of course it didn't. And so they eventually decided to pull out, cut their losses, and move their forces down to the southeast and consolidate them there. And they're trying to push back the Ukrainians because they only had part of the southeastern portion. They want Luhansk and Donetsk, the two provinces down there. They want the whole thing, and who knows, maybe more. And as you point out, they also, I think they've got part of they've established a land bridge from Crimea to the Donbass region, if they can get Mariupol. And some indications are today that they're inside Mariupol now.
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah, that's disputed whether that's fallen or not. But that's the last thing. That's the last town there. And then if they go the other way, they have Kherson, and they might try to take Odessa and go all the way to Moldova, because in Moldova, which is right next to just to the west of Ukraine, there's also a Russian-speaking area, which they already have troops in. So they might want to cut off Ukraine's seacoast, because, of course, they think that would greatly handicap Ukraine.
Indeed, it would.
Bring it under Russian control, even if they don't get the whole country.
Let me just pause for a second and remind everybody that we do welcome so many participants from around the country who are with us on this conversation. People are joining us via our YouTube page, our Facebook page, Vimeo, Twitter, and all of our friends over at thinkspot.com. Just a word of welcome to all of them. And in fact, already I'm getting some comments from our participants. One of our friends named Christy says that she's hoping the G20 summit will bring some resolution. Any comment on that, Ivan?
Well, I'm not sure that that's where it's going to be decided. I think the real problem here, sometimes when you flood a place with weapons, or you become allied with a group or a country, and they're small, and you're backing them up against a bigger country. This has already happened in Georgia in 2008, when George Bush told Ukraine and Georgia they would eventually get into NATO. Well, what did the leader of Georgia do? He started a war in the separatist regions of Georgia. And this gets lost that he's the one that started the war. And of course, the Russians invaded. Now, they didn't take the whole country at that point. They just took over the separatist regions. So you have to be careful that Ukraine doesn't get so triumphalist in what's happened that they get to be uncontrollable and do things that might get us into trouble, escalation with Russia. I mean, some of these attacks, the Ukrainians already seem to be attacking into Russia, fuel depots, military infrastructure, even near Moscow. These are sporadic attacks, but, they could cause problems. I think some of the rhetoric out of the Biden administration has been excessive in that they called Putin a war criminal. They've termed it genocide in Ukraine. They've said they want to win the war, help Ukraine win the war, that is, and then also weaken Russia.
Weaken Russia. That's the part that really struck me.
Right. Well, and that, part of the we need to go back in time to look at the roots of this conflict, and NATO bears some responsibility for this, although it's hard not to blame Putin for invading another country and brutalizing it like he's doing, but you have to look at the reasons, as Rand Paul pointed out in the Senate the other day.
Yeah, he did. I'll just interrupt you briefly. I'm looking at this piece from the Washington Post from a few days ago. So apparently it was last Tuesday, Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, had a rather feisty exchange with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And on last week, the Washington Post published this thing saying Rand Paul is partly right. and in that conversation, apparently Rand Paul said, while there is no justification for Putin's war on Ukraine, it does not follow that there's no explanation for the invasion. So Rand Paul was trying to, walk a fine line there between justifying it and explaining it. His explanation was a great deal to do with the way that other countries, including Russia, perceive the expansion of NATO. So even the Washington Post is sort of admitting, or did admit, that Rand Paul's caution about the expansion of NATO may not have been so far off the mark. So maybe you're in good company if both the Washington Post and Rand Paul seem to be cautioning along the lines of NATO. Is that fair?
Well, I think that's sort of remarkable, given the Washington Post's history of being rather hawkish on everything that we do overseas. So I think, Americans aren't very good at remembering anything, and they're not good at introspection when the United States government might have at least played a role in something. And certainly the trouble started really in 2004 and 2008. And what's common with those years is that the NATO alliance is either talking about expanding or expanding. In the 2008 NATO summit, that's when George W. Bush, that is, said, we're eventually going to let Ukraine and Georgia in. And that really soured relations with Putin. And I would even say, if you really want to go a little farther, Putin is such a nationalist leader, and Russians tend to like strong leaders, but he's really an ultra-nationalist KGB agent and former KGB agent. And one of the reasons I think he was able to take power was the fact that NATO was already expanding. It expanded in 1999 for the first time, and that's when he started his ascent to power. And so, he may never have even been the leader of Russia had not NATO expanded. I'm not saying it's the only reason, but it's certainly a role.
Certainly. Yeah, I'm going to turn to our other colleague, Bill Watkins, in a minute here, but you're reminding me of something else I read in the Post, Ivan. Fascinating. I didn't know this, but George Kennan, the famous American diplomat, he wrote in 1997 that expanding NATO would be, quote, the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era and would inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion. That's George Kennan. He's no, right-wing icon. He's part of the mainstream foreign policy establishment, cautioning back in 1997 that pushing for the expansion of NATO, which President George W. Bush did push for, with bipartisan support, would be a fateful error. So you agree with George Kennan, apparently, too, Ivan.
Yes, well, I think this mistake has been made before in history. After the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon just tromped around Europe doing what he wanted, and he was finally defeated in the Congress of Vienna in 1815. The other European countries by gritting their teeth, they brought France back into the European world. Of course, they did not do that with Kaiser's Germany after World War I. They rubbed the loser's nose in it, and look what we got. We got Nazis.
Yeah, it didn't work out.
Fascism, etc. Another person who tromped around Europe. Well, then after the Cold War was over, you would think that they would have tried to welcome Russia in. You have to grit your teeth a little bit to do so, but Russia felt it was on the other side of the curtain, and the curtain kept pushing east. I mean, NATO is right on the border of Russia in the Baltics right now, and if Ukraine joined, it would be the same in the south. And these are invasion routes that really matter because Russia has been invaded from the west many times by the Poles, by the twice, by Napoleon, and of course the last German invasion was the Nazis, where they had scorched earth, the most cataclysmic combat in human history. They lost 28 to 30 million people. And it
resonates.
Their May 9th celebration is coming up, and people are thinking, well, Putin's going to try something here to get some sort of a victory by then. World War II is a big thing, and the reason was that the Soviets beat the Nazis, and just cataclysmic combat. 85% of the German Wehrmacht casualties were on the Eastern Front.
Yes.
And it was, and they remember that. And those invasion routes, Poland is now in NATO. The Baltics are now in NATO. And Ukraine, that's the whole problem right there. They have legitimate security concerns. I'm not saying I support what they did here, because I think they're making it worse by now Finland and Sweden are going to join. We've got more NATO troops pushed forward. He's got Ukrainian nationalism. So it was kind of counterproductive what he did.
Extremely counterproductive and vicious, really, in its implementation.
But and Russia does have legitimate security concerns on the West because it's very flat there. And that's why he wants to lock up Ukraine, Belarus, those areas.
It's interesting to put this in context of maybe Ukrainian and Russian character and opinion. Bill Watkins, you spent some time in Ukraine, as I recall. What can you tell us about the sense of Ukrainian national identity as distinct from Russian from the time when you may have had your contacts?
No, I was last there in 2019 and really was in the East and a lot of what is now occupied territory. For example, Verdansk. I taught at Verdansk State University, where not too many weeks ago it was on the news with a Russian ship sunk there at the harbor, not very far from Mariupol. There was sort of a split in my class. I had some Ukrainian nationalist students that only wanted Ukrainian spoken at the state university, whereas others that, and again, everyone over there speaks Russian. It's no matter what part you speak Russian.
What translator did you have, into Russian or into Ukrainian or both?
Into Ukrainian was my translator. But there were a number of students that weren't so gung-ho at the time about Ukrainian nationalism. They just wanted to live and get along. I had others that their families had fled from the Donbass, the occupied areas there. So there was a split there. Still many looked on as Russians as their brothers, kinsmen. I have a feeling that has changed for a lot of them now with the invasion. In Zaporizhia, where the fighting is approaching, and we've seen the convoy recently arrive from the steel works in Mariupol. I have a professor friend there who hosted me that he is currently interviewing these individuals from Mariupol for evidence of war crimes that will undoubtedly happen at some time when the conflict is over at the ICJ. So I think, certainly attitudes have changed greatly, would be my guess, with the destruction and the strife so far.
Could it be said that the sense of Ukrainian distinct national identity may have been heightened by this invasion?
No, there's no doubt. I think it has, from the emails I've been able to exchange with some of my friends still over there. This is really, and I agree with Ivan about the NATO expansion as certainly a cause of the conflict. But I think Putin just made a terrible miscalculation, because he's going to end up not only possibly with Ukraine pushing some of his troops out of the region, and who knows, they might even win the conflict with Western weapons, but he spited himself because Finland, Sweden will enter NATO. So his situation that, again, he had a decent gripe about with NATO expansion gets worse. Ukrainian nationalism increases as these people really forge themselves into a nation in this fight. And his country's situation is all the worse. It was, while we can explain some reasons that he might have had, the outcome not going to be good for Russia.
Yeah, wow. Given the fact that Putin's military has been so vicious and really unforgivably brutal, it's easy for me, maybe many other people, to feel a great sympathy for the apparent underdog. Ukraine is smaller and less, militarily equipped and so forth in principle. I feel a great sympathy. One almost hopes to see them, pushing them back and triumphing even further and so forth. But Ivan, from the point of view of somebody who might, let's say, be advising Western policymakers, which, we hope you're kind of in that position, if peace is to be achieved, and any peace is better than ongoing, vicious, brutal war that could escalate. If peace is to be achieved, should we be hoping that Ukraine gets the maximum potential advantage on the battlefield so as to force a favorable peace, or what's the best way for this thing to wind down?
Well, I think that's probably the only way you're going to get Putin to have some sort of a peace, is have the Ukrainians at least have some advantage on the battlefield. But the problem that you have is, I think that Ukrainians have already, the U.S. has sort of suggested neutrality, and the Ukrainians have said yes. But I think the sticking point with the Ukrainians is they would like their territory back that Russia, Crimea and
right.
The Donbass region back. And the problem is Russia has had that for, almost 8 years now. And the separatists there, the people who have the Russian affinity, they're not going to want to be, they're going to feel abandoned because, you've left us to the wolves. So that's, Putin's not really going to want to do that. And Crimea is very strategic to him. That's why
there's no way they'll give up Crimea.
Right, because it's a naval base. It's very strategic, and they don't have, they need historically they've needed a warm water port, and you still have to go through the Turkish Dardanelles, but it's a great military naval base there, and so they're not going to give up that. So the problem, any situation you can eventually reach an agreement, but this one is kind of vexing because you can't really see it forming, because.
But a lot of it has to do, right. But I think a lot of it must have to do with the degree to which the U.S. presidential administration, tells or gives signals to Mr. Zelensky's regime in Kyiv. How much should the U.S. back up the Ukrainian position? Should the U.S. stand for the proposition that every square inch of Ukraine should be given back, or else war will escalate with U.S. support? Is that what the U.S. should do?
No.
Okay.
Russia has,
I knew you'd be clear on that, Ivan.
Russia has more nuclear weapons than we do. We don't. Biden's quite correct that we don't do a no-fly zone, because that would be bring us into direct contact with Russian forces. And they were also right not to raise the alert level, because so far that's been a bluff. The Russians have made no operational attempt to increase their alert level. And I think Russia's actually been very cautious about not fighting with a superior foe. So, and NATO, believe me, is superior in every way to the Russian forces. both conventional and nuclear. And so he's probably not going to do that. But he has his own internal thing. I mean, he's the strong man, the guy. And if the opposition to the war gets bad enough in Russia, if people actually figure out how many people they've probably lost there, he could be in trouble at home. I'm not predicting that necessarily because he is a strong man, and I don't think U.S. policy should be based on it. But I think we control the spigot of the weapons, but the Ukrainians can fight on even without the U.S. They were doing well without the the 50 billion worth that we've given them since the war started. They were doing well right from the start, and part of that is U.S. training. But it's also a will to fight. It shows you what organizations can do if their workforce is motivated versus not motivated, like the Russians.
It's stunning. I thought that the human factor was over with technology, but maybe not.
Not in warfare. No, you have to. Those are a lot of those are conscripts for the Russians, and the Ukrainians are. Whenever you attack another country, as we found out in Iraq, there's resistance, and it takes a while to put down that resistance, and sometimes it's not successful in being putting it down because they're fighting for their homes, their families, and the more the Russians brutalize them, the harder they're going to fight. So it's really bad. It's bad for any military to kill civilians. It's not only immoral, which of course is the first thing. The second thing is it makes the enemy fight harder.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think you are probably a voice for judicious compromise in a number of ways. I hope that your voice is heard in DC policy circles, Ivan.
Well, I hope so too. I hope they stop with this rhetoric. I think they've got to stop with the rhetoric. Thomas Friedman agrees with me, and today's New York Times, I rarely agree with him, but he wrote a pretty good column today about let's use restraint in the language and let's use restraint otherwise there.
I am going to turn our attention back to our side of the Atlantic. And I'm probably going to need some help from Bill Watkins on this one. Bill, we were talking earlier about the fact that last week, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, announced in testimony before a House committee that he's starting this new thing called the Disinformation Governance Board. And he said it's going to be focused on this preventing the spread of disinformation in minority communities ahead of the 2020 midterm elections. And then Jen Psaki, President Biden's spokesperson, said that, of course, President Biden supports this effort. She says, we know there has been a range of disinformation out there about a range of topics. I mean, including COVID, for example, and also elections and eligibility. What I can tell you is that the objective of the board is to prevent disinformation and misinformation from traveling around the country in a range of communities. So that's Jen Psaki and Secretary Mayorkas. What do you think this Disinformation Governance Board is all about? It sounds pretty darn eerie to me, Bill.
Graham, how could you be against the truth and our new Ministry of Truth? Comrade, please, you must support these things. No, obviously, what a terrible idea. We have a First Amendment, so we will have a marketplace of ideas where people can get information from various sources. I mean, as usual, prior to the internet, there's always been a danger people will publish in newspapers or otherwise incorrect facts, or they will have certain opinions that others disagree with.
Well, what if their opinions are inflammatory? We shouldn't allow inflammatory opinions, should we?
No,
provocative opinions?
Right, especially not to influence a voting group in minority communities that the Democratic Party wants to count on solidly for an election victory.
Oh, what a cynic you are, Bill.
But I mean, that's the stated purpose of this. No, it is Orwellian. Of course it is. It's something that you really, I mean, this is a bridge too far to have a Ministry of Truth here, which is essentially what this is. And if you look at how many mistakes, honest or otherwise,
yes, or otherwise,
our government has made about important information or our mainstream media, whether it be Hunter Biden's laptop is a fake, the Russians rigged the 2016 election and controlled the outcome. COVID, you don't need to wear masks. You need to wear masks. Kamala Harris eventually started out saying she wouldn't take a vaccine.
Oh, yeah, because Trump helped develop it. She said she wasn't going to take the vaccine.
Right, because she couldn't trust it. Then all of a sudden, if you're not getting the vaccine, you're some sort of traitor to America because you have concerns about what you're putting in your body and have some autonomy issues. In light of that track record, I really don't know who would trust our government to determine what's the truth, what's disinformation.
No, sad to say.
They need to be out of that business. This new board needs to be shut down from, thank you, George W. Bush, for Department of Homeland Security itself. Sounds a bit Orwellian there, but no, terrible idea.
Well, I read that apparently the choice of the Biden administration to be the disinformation chief is a woman named Nina Jankowicz, and she is already in charge of the Homeland Security Department's effort to fight online disinformation on elections and coronavirus. And she has already been quoted in the past as saying that she's an expert on disinformation, and she's called the Hunter Biden laptop story alleged and part of a Kremlin influence scheme. Now, of course, we've discovered recently that even the mainstream media is acknowledging that the Hunter Biden laptop story was accurate, was not made up. But what about in the intervening time? What if this Nina Jankowicz had been in charge and she decided that the story was false? Would she have had the power to suppress news about it from the perch in the government until it turns out the facts turn around and then the government changes its mind? And then she says, how could anything like this actually operate in America? Wouldn't this be totally destroyed by lawsuits, Bill?
No, it would certainly be obstructed by lawsuits. And we're talking about our friend, Mr. Putin, and his country and how he manages information there about the war. And we certainly hear many individuals complaining that he shut off links to Western sites and others so his people won't hear the truth about that. And I agree, that's a terrible thing he's done. But how's our government any better with this new board, essentially trying to do the same thing, but they're going to cloak themselves in the American flag and platitudes about democracy and protecting minority voters and march and do the same thing. You're absolutely right. With this new position, rather than just being some talking head at the Woodrow Wilson Center,
yes.
Now she is empowered and can use the vast networks from the swamp to suppress stories if she thinks they're untrue.
You can see there's a very familiar reflex at work in this matter and in so many others. And the reflex is, it's kind of a progressive reflex, but maybe it's become a quintessentially American reflex, namely something's bad, so the government needs to coercively stop it. Sometimes when things are bad, it's better for the government not to coercively stop it, but for private parties to get to work at it and talk about it and discredit stupidity. Government coercion should be used so sparingly, it seems to me, because it has a track record of so much abuse. But this reflex is a pretty strong one.
No, it's the first resort now for people.
It's the first resort. Yeah, exactly.
If I could just add one thing.
Oh, please.
I second Bill's comments. I think probably the original threat was a bit overstated on the Russian manipulation of social media in the first place. That doesn't mean that Donald Trump should have solicited somebody to do an illegal hack in the Democratic National Committee, but certainly the other part of that, election interference was supposed to be this massive social media interference by the Russians. And I think that was vastly overstated, They probably tried some stuff. Oh, yeah. I'm not saying they didn't try anything, but I think, Thomas Jefferson said the best way to counter, scandalous disinformation or any other kind of disinformation is to just enter the marketplace of ideas and put the truth out, or what you think is the truth. The argument. Let's have an argument about it, rather than having a ministry, if you want, or a department board to judge facts and information. That is quite scary, I think.
The late P.J. O'Rourke, who was a good friend of the Independent Institute and a good friend of our late wonderful colleague David Thoreau, he had said in the past that the Department of Homeland Security, he said, sounded like a failed savings and loan. the last thing you want to be given more authority. I did notice that Secretary Mayorkas, he did, in the hullabaloo that ensued after his initial announcement, he kind of said some backtracking things. I was relieved to see that. He backtracked a bit by saying, well, there was no question that the department could have done a better job in communicating about this board. And he said, really, it's not about speech. It's about the connectivity to violence, he said. Okay. Well, even that makes me a little concerned, because if you can make lots of claims about the connectivity of speech to violence, and they're not all true. It's too easy a claim, isn't it, Bill?
No, I think most violence I've seen connected to speech comes from the left, and something tells me that they're not interested in suppressing Black Lives Matter speech or anything like that.
Well, what if it's connected to violence?
Well, I saw Vice President Harris wanted to bail folks out, take up money for rioters and such. I don't think if it's the right kind of violence, they don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, well, let's make sure we speak to our side too, or so-called our side. I'm not interested in the violence of the people who stormed the Capitol either. Violence is no good, but regulating speech is never the answer. That's just never the answer.
No, Ivan said it best. We need more speech, not less, in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. Ivan says good things. Okay.
Sometimes I get a thought off every once in a while.
You do, Ivan. You definitely do. Yeah, you should be one of those guys who comes up with the sound bites. You need better sound bites from Ivan Eland. So, okay, legal stuff going a little further. Coming your way, Bill. Boy, oh boy, it's just a week for legal news. How could it be, Bill, that a preliminary draft opinion written by one of the associate justices of the U.S. Supreme Court could be leaked in advance of the court's decision and issuance? Has this ever happened before? And should we be glad or sad about it?
Sure. In the past, you've had leaks about a vote change or how the court was going to rule in a particular case, some days before. But I've never in my life gotten my hands on a draft Supreme Court opinion before it was issued. And I'll be frank, as soon as I could pull that thing offline, that was all I was doing, was reading.
You were reading that avidly. In fact, I just point out to our participants today that William J. Watkins Jr. has already published a piece on our website called The Beacon, in which he analyzes the draft opinion, much to be recommended. But go on, Bill. This is unprecedented. Okay.
No, it's unprecedented and it's unfortunate. And really what we see here, and we don't know who leaked the opinion. I think my guess would be, it would be logical, that it would be someone on the left that, again, we've had this rhetoric in every election that apparently abortion is the most sacred right in America. And if it is not fully protected by the Supreme Court, we become Vladimir Putin's Russia. And the progressives who are believing this sort of claptrap, seeing this opinion coming out, one of their number in the Supreme Court, probably a clerk for one of the justices, hopes that by leaking this, that pressure can be put on the court as an institution from Congress, from the media, and others, that maybe you can have a switch of a vote. Perhaps a weak link on that opinion could be a Kavanaugh would be my best guess. Maybe even a Gorsuch or a Barrett, who knows? But Kavanaugh probably the best bet to flip. I would imagine Chief Justice Roberts is not on board with this opinion.
Well, according to the draft, his name is not yet appended to that opinion, right? Correct.
But I see this again as a 5-4 decision right now, with Roberts in the minority, because he's an institutionalist. He doesn't care so much about the truth. As you and I talked about earlier, in all the criticism of what the court perhaps is about to do, overturning Roe and Casey, there is very little from any scholar defending the legal reasoning of those decisions and why Alito, in his opinion, is wrong on the law. It's all policy. This is good policy. This is a fundamental right that we can't even question.
Or they're justice arguments that come from beyond the text of the Constitution about the unfairness of nature to women and so forth. That kind of rhetoric is not legal rhetoric. It may be compelling, but it doesn't seem to have a place in the law.
No, it doesn't have a place in the law. And what people shouldn't forget, let's say this opinion is published and this is the law. Policy, they can make any argument they want in their various state legislatures and lobby their elected representatives if they think the Roe regime and the Casey regime, the undue burden standard, was appropriate. States can write that into law. It's not over. The problem is we live in a world where we're no longer a federation of states. There's no real federalism that people recognize in the United States. They want national solutions to every problem. The states are not allowed to be laboratories of democracy, so we can watch different approaches, see how they work, look at the merits and demerits, and craft policies otherwise. It's a winner-take-all system, which our country was not designed to be, and this is at the height of it.
Yes. We're moving now beyond the question of the leakage and the strategy behind that into the apparent argument being made by apparently Justice Alito to overturn Roe and Casey, as you say. I heard the other day as I was driving to work, I heard a law professor being interviewed on the radio, and his comment was that if this were to happen and Roe were struck down, Casey were struck down, and the states reacquired their jurisdiction over abortion law, that America would turn into a nightmarish, crazy quilt of differing rules. He said nightmarish. And I was thinking to myself, I understand why it would be a crazy quilt, but why would that be nightmarish? I mean, isn't it really the case that there are some issues that they cut so deep and divide America so profoundly that maybe it's not possible or even wise, much less constitutionally valid, to have one solution for the entire country? I mean, a lot of these educational things fall in the same category. America has actually a constitutional framework which could allow for the separation, the diffusion, 50 laboratories of democracy, as we like to say sometimes. We actually have a constitutional structure that can contain irreconcilable moral divergences. It's the constitutional order with states and a federal government. What's so bad, what's so nightmarish about using our system to contain our insoluble disagreements?
How much easier would it be to get along if the people of California, for example, who tend to be much more progressive than my people in South Carolina, could legislate on their own for abortion, whether their state wants to implement the death penalty. They can handle their homeless population as they see best, etc. If they want a minimum wage of $20 an hour, let them enact it, and we can watch and see how well all this plays out. Those are internal domestic matters that the framers told us each state would be free to govern. My state would and does probably look at those matters different, but it's no skin off their back if we enact laws that are consistent with our culture, with the temperament of our people, with our local circumstances. But again, that has been lost to this idea of there has to be a national solution. The quilt you mentioned is forgotten. It looks like even with difficult issues like drug legalization, marijuana, we're starting to see that quilt across the country with recreational drug use legalized and possession in many places. And the world hasn't ended. The rest of us that don't have those laws can watch how is crime going up? Is addiction going up? Or
I've read that Colorado's having second thoughts, for example. But that's their deal. Figure it out.
No, that's right. And that's, again, that's there. I'm glad that they've experimented with this. And if it doesn't work, they want to say, there have been unintended consequences. Well, it's great that, say, my state or another state has watched that and said, maybe we don't want to do that based on what's happened, rather than the whole country being forced headlong into a matter. There's tremendous benefits to federalism if we would just embrace it.
There really are such benefits. It's an amazing system. I mean, there are some things that are laid down plain that have to be the same everywhere, but they're pretty minimal. And the things which the federal government can and cannot do are laid out in the text of the Constitution. I'm looking at it here. I keep this often in my pocket. You probably do too, Bill. And the question really comes down to, for a judge and the court, comes down to not, well, women need abortion or women don't need access to abortion. Really, the question is, where in the four corners of this document are the fixed rules, and where is there jurisdictional wiggle room left for the states? And I think it may well be that if this decision comes down something like it is indicated in this leak, that it may be a remarkable rejuvenation of America's constitutional federalism. California's Governor Newsom just said, for example, he's not going to take it. California's going to statutorily codify all the rights to abortion. California's probably going to pay for abortions, elective abortions. They're just not going to stand for it. Well, okay, I'm a Californian. I can vote against that if I want to, or for it. But California can do that. Gavin Newsom, he's just upset that the thing has been given back to him. He thought it was settled.
No, but we got to be careful here, because while I agree with you, it could be a regeneration of federalism. Do not underestimate the Biden administration and Congress and how the courts and Congress have manipulated certain clauses of the Constitution, mainly the Commerce Clause and the Spending Clause.
Right.
And I would bet that if this decision comes out, there will be a strong push to still have a nationalized abortion law using the commerce power, essentially arguing that, well, if some states no longer have abortion, this will affect the national market for the procedure, and therefore this substantially affects interstate commerce, as some women will travel to other states to have abortions, and therefore Congress can act, or they will withhold perhaps healthcare funds from states if they do not enact abortion laws in line with what Congress directs. So unfortunately, there are avenues, even if this opinion is issued, that the national government, though it frankly has, there's no power over abortion for it in the Constitution. But these clauses, again, commerce essentially applied to trade, really deep water shipping, and to remove internal trade barriers in the Union. But it's been so manipulated that almost any activity, if you look at it in the aggregate, they say affects commerce, and they legislate.
Well, there are 6 or 7 months still in which the party which formally supports full access to abortion at all times for all reasons, that party retains majority in the House and the Senate and holds the presidency. 7 months. During that 7 months, they could try and gain that legislation and maybe gain some votes for it in the November elections. Although unfortunately, it's just as likely to have the opposite effect. It's a very difficult political calculation, I would think, for President Biden and others. Because, after all, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that she feared that the decision in Roe would actually back in 1973, would actually undermine support for liberalized abortion laws, because it would so exacerbate and inflame moral concerns in the country. Strangely enough, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was something of a Roe skeptic herself, and that may still apply.
No, she was right, because, much like gay marriage with the Obergefell decision, states were enacting progressive laws, progressive constitutional amendments. The left was winning, but they had to have it all. So they short-circuited political debate, citizens trying to influence one another and their elected representatives, and they went to the courts, to unelected officials, and they short-circuited all of that and created a firestorm that has never let up, especially with the abortion issue. So I think Ginsburg was right, though she was obviously a big supporter of abortion rights, but it inflamed the political process. And will we ever have peace on this issue where, again, states can enact their own laws, people can vote with their feet under a federal system?
Of Roe and Casey, Justice Ginsburg, the late Justice Ginsburg, said, doctrinal limbs too swiftly shaped, experience teaches, may prove unstable. Okay, now here's the Alito opinion basically saying these doctrinal limbs were too swiftly shaped and they're unstable and we're taking the limbs down. It's almost like he's echoing Ruth Bader Ginsburg unexpectedly.
Yeah, he quotes Justice Ginsburg in his opinion.
So I hear.
He also quotes a number of liberal scholars that, again, admit that Roe had a shaky constitutional ground, from Lawrence Tribe. Some of Harry Blackmun's own law clerks have admitted that this is made up. And as Justice Alito pointed out, the Roe majority didn't really point to a constitutional provision where the right is found. It's sort of somewhere in there, and we're using the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. Trust us, we've got this.
I've been ignoring Ivan. Feel free to jump in here, Ivan, if you want to opine on this matter of federalism, especially.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Bill a question. Brett Stevens, who's a conservative, wrote a piece today saying they shouldn't. He made a Burkean institutionalist type of argument that Roberts might make, that they shouldn't overturn Roe versus Wade because it's a I don't want to say revolutionary, but it's a radical change. And as an institutionalist, it undermines incremental change, which conservative some in the conservative movement think undermines the rule of law. But I would, from your comments, I would say that you probably disagreed with that perspective.
No, I do disagree with it, though you will see a lot in the dissents, I'm sure, if this pans out like we think, about stare decisis, the value of precedent, how people order their affairs based on certain precedents, the length of time this decision has been around since 73, which is almost 50 years now. So I mean, those are not inconsequential arguments. I get that. However, what I cannot get away from is the lack of a legal foundation for that opinion, or any of the the Griswold line of cases that led to Roe, where we talk about penumbras having emanations, these shadow zones from the Bill of Rights, where it might, the shadow of amendments dealing with quartering troops, searches and seizures, etc., somehow coalesce to form this right to an abortion and contraceptives, etc., in some of the court's cases. Again, are some of the laws we might think silly, like Griswold, that married couples in Connecticut couldn't have access to contraceptives?
That was silly.
As Justice Black said, that's an asinine law. If I were in the legislature, Black says, I would not vote for such a law. But I'm not in the legislature, and I don't sit in a super legislature, which the Supreme Court claims itself to be. And this goes back, this takes us to the whole just dangerous web that substantive due process has brought us. The court using the words due process to see certain liberty interests, again, in things they like, and constitutionalizing them. It's been dreadful, taken so much out of the political process, given the courts unelected individuals these superpowers to make constitutional law, to frame these matters. It's just not been good for our republic.
The argument made in defense of Roe and Casey oftentimes goes like this. Women have a constitutional right somehow or other. Well, really, then, if you unpack that, people say, well, the argument really is women have a natural right to have an abortion. And so if women have a natural right, it's got to be in here somehow because they have a natural right to it. And this is really a very interesting point to me because a lot of Americans feel strongly that certain things are natural rights or naturally good and naturally correct, and they may or may not be. But actually, both the left and the right have a bad temptation to say that because something's naturally right or a natural right, it's got to be upheld by this document. Well, it's not the same thing, actually. The law is not morality writ in stone. The law is distinct. It has its own character, and that can disappoint the left. It can disappoint the right. But in the long run, we are all so much better off by having a stable written rule of law that doesn't flex with the latest trends of opinion. We are all safer, even though it'll disappoint both sides because it's not as morally glorious as we might wish it were, whether from one side or the other. Can you comment, Bill? We're coming to a close here pretty soon, but can you comment on some of the other cases, like this Christian flag flying on the Boston City Hall, which the Boston government wouldn't allow, but maybe the court's going to make them do it? What's that all about? Did you follow that?
No, yeah. Essentially, this is a unanimous opinion, actually. Boston tells an individual that though they have 3 flag poles outside their city hall and regularly let individuals for special occasions apply and fly a flag, again, for a short duration, for, say, a celebration of whatever. They've done it with gay rights. They've done it with private corporations, a bank, that you can do that. But they declined to let a gentleman fly the Christian flag when he made his application. And that's the only application they've ever denied.
The only one they did. They had the rainbow flag up there frequently, I bet.
Yep.
Okay, well, fine. But why did they single him out? What was their reason? I wonder.
We know what their reason was. Their stated reason, though, was that they were afraid that this would cause an establishment of religion. And
and the others don't?
To be halfway fair to Boston there, the Supreme Court's Lemon Test and its establishment case law is such a mess that I'd almost want to give them a break for coming to that ridiculous conclusion, because the law is so been tortured there. When you look at our text and history, the founders wanted to make sure that Congress didn't establish a national religion, i.e. that the Episcopal Church is the national religion of the U.S. And such. It has nothing to do with flying a flag or having a menorah at a Christmas.
All sorts of symbolic affirmations that just were not part of the concern about establishment at the time.
Right. But the court unanimously held, and of course, Justice Breyer has to come through with a 4 or 5 point test that he made up out of his head that we look at. But essentially, it was the right result that this was not government speech, government sponsored speech.
Yes.
This was not an establishment of religion. Now, of course, Boston could, in retrospect, now adopt certain policies about what it will allow there and treat that even-handedly. But their whole establishment worry was misguided. And if you get 9-0 in the Supreme Court, that ought to tell you something about how.
That ought to tell you something. Yeah, it definitely should. Wow. Okay. Well, there's a lot of things going on all around the world. Let's just come back for a landing to Ivan. Do you want to make any predictions or offer your best words of advice to Secretary of State Blinken, Ivan, on the Ukraine situation? Parting wisdom,
I would
please.
just offer some words of caution. We got sucked into World War I when we loaned lots of money to the English, particularly the English, but some to the French. And so when we're flooding the arms over to Ukraine, we're even getting more deeper. Well, we're getting deeper than we were in supporting the British entry into World War I. And I, as a background, I think World War I was when we went off the deep end into foreign intervention. We hadn't intervened in European wars, and I think that helped lead to World War II. It's an unconventional look at history, but I think it's a realistic one. So and all this rhetoric about the genocide and Putin being a war criminal and all that stuff, it's probably true. Maybe he's been very brutal, but whether you really want to say that, I think the rhetoric, they're getting a little bit ahead of themselves with the triumphalist rhetoric. And I think that, Ukraine is winning, and they probably should make Ukraine pay us back for the weapons eventually. Maybe that's unrealistic, and they've already committed to do this, and they have to watch which weapons they send. I would not send aircraft. I think they were correct in doing that because I
got to give President Biden credit there.
Right. Well, they could bomb Moscow, and that's the Russians are going to regard that as an escalatory measure. Maybe if you give them 10, that's okay, but no planes.
Okay. Point well taken, Ivan. And then turning back to you finally, Bill Watkins. So what's your advice to Chief Justice Roberts? Should he now, under this pressure from the public disclosure, should he then try and join the majority so as to control the opinion and change all of Alito's words? What's your advice to the poor Chief Justice?
My advice to the poor Chief Justice is when you have a decision that has no basis in American constitutional law, as Roe and Casey, and he knows this, as much as he wants to protect the institution, do the right thing. This needs to be scrapped. This is just a terrible decision. I understand he doesn't want the court to seem a political message to Justice Roberts. It's too late for that. The public already perceives that. Just do the right thing as you read the law.
Moreover, if he does finagle and maneuver so as to prevent the court from seeming political, that in itself would be actually evidence of a political calculation on his part.
If the Obamacare opinion wasn't a complete political calculation by Roberts, that was, I think, worse than in the long term than the court striking it down, which was his worry. Then what shall we say about this? Chief Justice, that battle is lost. Do the right thing.
All right. Let's hope he's listening in here. So to both of you, Bill Watkins, I say thank you so much, Bill.
Great to be here.
Pleasure. And Ivan Eland, it's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
And all of our friends who joined us from around the country and maybe from some places overseas, thank you for joining us for Independent Outlook. Come back in a couple of weeks as we give you some more pearls of wisdom on Independent Outlook from the Independent Institute here in California. And of course, you can always go to our website, independent.org, where you can find Bill Watkins' latest analysis of court issues, articles by Ivan Eland, and many other people, independent.org. Visit us as your resource. Thanks to all and to all. Goodbye for today.